Before this episode, I just wanted to let all of our loyal listeners know that this show is moving to a monthly release schedule. I'm sure that some of you who listen to the episodes as they are released have noticed that there was a little bit of a gap since the previous episode. From now on and until you hear otherwise from me, we will be releasing new episodes on the first Sunday of every month. Thank you. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Eliot.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today, we are going to be talking about some things that exist in the real world or that we encounter in the real world, but we just avoid bringing into the game. And we're also going to be talking about why we don't bring these things into the game. We're hopefully going to be giving a little bit more insight into not only our personal preferences, but also some things that just don't get translated into games. And on the surface, they look like they would be good things to include. But I think that a lot of times, if you start actually trying to work out how you would put these things into a game, it becomes a game in and of itself in how to get this to be represented in a role-playing game. So where do we want to start from this? In all of our bullshitting before the podcast, we didn't really go over like just kind of where we were going to start with this. Do you guys have anywhere you want to anything burning that you want to talk about first?
Well, we've got a few that are probably kind of like hot button issues on here, but to get us kind of up to momentum, maybe we could start with some of the things that are just maybe kind of like dull, like the more mundane sorts of things that we just kind of like, breeze past. What do you think about that?
I'm good with that. So what's something that's mundane that you don't want to deal with in a game?
Well, there's one thing that I've sometimes just kind of forced to happen for convenience, and that is bathroom breaks. Nobody ever says, I get up and take a piss, when you're camped out or whatever. But I have definitely contrived a situation where I roll a random encounter or something like that, and often I will say, okay, you get up, you walk, 30 paces away from the campfire, you're taking a piss, and you hear a, branch break behind you or something like that. So that's one, bathroom stuff. Another one that kind of goes along with that is just general hygiene. Like nobody's ever taken a bath. Nobody's ever like cleaning anything. Not just their bodies, but their weapons and all that. You're slogging through the mud. You got gore all over you. There's little spells to deal with that. On like item lists and stuff, you'll see like soap. There will be services for bath and stuff like that sometimes, but like I've never seen anyone jump to that. Have you?
Funny you should mention that particular one, particularly hygiene, because I've been playing the game Elden Ring a lot the past couple of months since it came out. And for a little while in the game, like reading about it online and stuff, people were like, what the hell is soap for? You can't make anything of it. And finally somebody realized, oh, if you're covered in poison or if you're covered in disease and things like that, you can use the soap and it just wipes away the tracker bar that has slowly been accumulating as you've been traipsing through shit. It just removes that. That's what soap does. That's the entire thing that soap does in the game.
That is awesome. I've not gotten to play this game yet. Now I extra want to play this game. Holy shit, that's so cool.
I'm very intimidated by that game, but I don't want to sidetrack the podcast. We can talk about that off pod. Can I throw in like a hot take?
Sure.
Because this isn't necessarily something I've noticed. Some people, Jordan, gets a huge kick out of this aspect of the game. And I find it maybe the most tedious thing in a game that I always cut out as a DM. And that is just carrying capacity. I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit what you carry. I don't give a shit how it affects your speed. All it does is, to me, the only thing that it does is slow my game down and add minutia that nobody gives a shit about. I fucking hate carrying capacity and thinking about that kind of shit. Hate it.
Well, can we go back to bathroom breaks and hygiene? There's a couple points there that I want to talk about.
Yeah, sure.
We'll do carrying capacity next. Bathroom breaks and hygiene, like in nature, bathroom breaks, taking a shit, taking a piss, that's when things are at their most vulnerable. Like the sloths. Almost every time a sloth is killed by a predator, it is when it comes down out of the tree to take a shit. That is a real world consequence of taking bathroom breaks. Whenever you're camping out and you're in hostile territory, any enemy who has any intelligence whatsoever is going to wait for the person who is on shift, on watch, to step out from the light of the campfire to piss. That's when that's the natural point at which they're going to be attacking. And yeah, I agree that it's something that we don't bring into the game, and we probably should, because that's a point of huge vulnerability for anyone. Just literally standing there with your dick in your hands. Like that's an expression of being caught surprise, and it exists for a reason.
Yeah, everybody's seen that movie scene, right? I mean, I can't even think of one off the top of my head, but I know there's like countless examples of that. Somebody dying as they're taking a shit in the woods.
And I think it goes right along with the disease stuff, like you were talking about, Clayton. Like, whenever diseases come up in fantasy settings, it seems like it's always either, some version of the bubonic plague, or it's some kind of like magical curse-like disease or something. But like, it's kind of like joked about that. I haven't looked if this is in recent versions, but for sure 1E D&D had a bunch of stuff about random diseases that you would get in the world, the dysentery, shit like that, your Oregon Trail killers. But a lot of those things kind of go along with the thing about hygiene, and to segue to the next point, like that's all part of the game simulation of a survival, wilderness kind of adventure versus, just kind of an epic narrative kind of thing. And that's where we get into the reasons why somebody might care about what kind of gear and tools and provisions that you have versus, getting to the story as Eliot wants to do.
But on the topic of diseases, though, and it's not as even, you're totally right. Like, I've never had a character get the flu or even really deal with a game where even NPCs were dealing with disease. And I think part of it might be the underlying assumed magical healing, but there's really a lot. I mean, you could build a very fun module at the very least around the idea of mundane diseases, because, in a medieval fantasy style world, life is hellish, brutal, and short, right? And a big part of that would be diseases. And if you assume that, I don't know what level spell cure disease is, but assuming it's a level 2, level 3 spell or something like that, I think it's higher than that in most D&D settings, that would mean that it would be a very elite healer who would be able to cure just a mundane disease. And the hierarchy that would come with that, you know what I mean? There's a lot of interesting ideas just in that concept of how do diseases get dealt with by just the common people in a magical world. There would be, just like in regular world, there's triage involved. Some people, I mean, it would create this whole class system of that's how the rich stay in power. how, like, you know, they can afford to be close. They can live in cities where it's more expensive to live. They can pay for the healing required, whereas average people, you know, they would have to travel for miles. Like, imagine if there was a huge outbreak of even just something like the flu in a small community. Think of how difficult it would be to get a healer to come from wherever they would be to come do that, and all the details. That could be an entire fun module to write and play that I've never even read about. You know what I mean?
I think the main reason why this isn't something that is in the games is from a player's perspective. Well, that's fucking bullshit.
For sure.
When did I make my roll for that? When was my constitution check? When was my fortitude check to see if I made that? Everything from a player's perspective, you only have control over your character. And a disease, even a natural one, is something that is out of your control, that is just something that is happening to you, that feels like a punishment to you for no reason. It could very easily be perceived as just the DM being vindictive to a particular player if the DM doesn't go into ahead of time, hey, in this game we're going to have actual diseases, and sometimes you're just going to get sick, and there's not going to be a particular point in the game where you can look back at and say, this is the thing that I did wrong. This is where I came into contact with something that got me sick, so I need to deal with that in the future by not doing that or taking precautions next time. I think that the movie Contagion did a phenomenal job of giving a dramatic representation of how diseases actually spread, and that is something that in a game most players aren't going to want that, something like that represented, where it is just so random and beyond any control.
And I think you have to, but I mean, I don't want to read into anybody into how you feel about that, but I mean, personally, I think you do have to take that into account. I think that's a thought worth respecting on the part of the player, because as we've all learned from this wonderful pandemic, it's that there really is no rhyme or reason most of the time. You know what I mean? You can wear your mask, you can get your vaccines. I mean, it's spiking around here again, and it's just like whatever, you know. And if you imagine you're a player and your DM's like, okay, guys, so 2 of you, yeah, you got the crud. So for the next 2 in-game days, yeah, your characters just have to lay in bed and drink fluids and stuff. I know you guys are. Everybody else decides to go get, you know, just that would be horrible as a player. That would be like, well, great. I'm really glad I sectioned off this time in my life for this game so I can spend the next 2 sessions. Oh, am I still sick? Yeah. Okay. While they're out doing that thing. Okay. You know, come on guys. Can you do me a solid and just everybody just stand still for 2 days so I can get well, you know? Oh, you're not going to do that? I'm just going to not be in this game? Okay. Awesome. You know what I mean? I mean, that is pretty lame.
I feel like most players are going to balk at the idea of things happening to them that are completely beyond their control. Because, like, yeah, bad shit happens, but in the story, these are supposed to be the heroes. If there is a disease going around that their character catches, there has to be, 1, a cause, and 2, there needs to be a solution. And I think that that's a big reason why real-world diseases don't often get represented, is because the solution for a disease, for many diseases, is you go to the doctor and you get medicine, or you stay at home and try to get better. And those are not dynamic. Those are not things of being an action-oriented solution to a problem. It's a very passive, sitting there letting your body heal is not something where you can do a lot of intense screen time to make it dramatic.
And that's also a big, sorry, Jordan, but this reminds me of something I want you guys to talk about too. Is this also one of the downfalls to very lethal games, in my opinion? That's another aspect to lethal games that can sometimes feel bad, or often get band-aided with like magic potions or some sort of like, in a lot of games that tend to be like really realistic in like how you get damaged and then have to naturally heal. Natural healing. I mean, if you have a character who breaks their leg or whatever in a world that doesn't have a lot of magical healing, I mean, that character just has to like not be very good at anything for 3 months while their leg heals. You know what I mean? That's a limiting factor I've found in those games that often has to get wallpapered over with some not very believable band-aids just to keep the game going.
I just looked it up, and Cure Disease in 1st edition was a 3rd level spell. Now in 5th edition, Cure Disease is not a spell anymore. It's covered by Lesser Restoration, which is a 2nd level spell. So something that you expect to at least be available in the larger cities with the larger temples, I would think, for some kind of price. What the what the cost of the healthcare system is in Dungeons and Dragons world is a topic for another day, I think. Back to the thing about disease stuff being part of the game. I could see a quick way of handling it that would essentially just be like docking people some of their downtime opportunities for training or working a job or whatever it is that people do spell research in their downtime. But it kind of belongs into that somewhat amorphous world of what in the hell adventurers do when they're not adventuring. But I think a lot of this is about what kind of tone of a game that you're trying to play. If you're playing the Lord of the Rings epic fantasy, then no, you probably don't care about dysentery. If you're playing some more like gritty survival kind of thing, especially if it's like a post-apocalyptic deal and people have gas masks as being like a normal part of their adventuring gear, then I could see it. It just depends on what you're going for and what the challenges are going to be for the players in dark sword and sorcery settings, like in the Elric stories and things like that. It's common to come across people who have a lame leg because they used to be an adventurer and they had a bad wound and never got healing, and now they're just hobbling along on crutches. It's along those lines. There's an entire city of plague-ridden beggars in the Young Kingdoms that is just completely full of heinous diseases.
And the game Skyrim is filled with city guards who suffered injuries like that and didn't have access to healing.
I was never one of those town killers. Real talk. I need to have that gameplay experience in Skyrim. Just make a character whose only goal is to attack every person in the town. I digress. Can we talk about carrying capacity now?
Sure.
I mean, I've already laid my cards out on the table. I figured there'd be an easy retort, then we can move on to a different idea, because there's so many other things we want to talk about, but I felt like I wanted to throw in carrying capacity because I know that it's a thing that I particularly find annoying, that I know Jordan really likes to keep track of it, and so what makes you really like it?
Couple things. For one, it forces the players to be more active in the planning of their expedition. Presenting a finite resource, which is your carrying capacity, means that you have to strategize about what you're carrying and why, and that is absolutely a part of any kind of overland travel, hiking, like any of that stuff throughout history. Like, exploration is all about just taking exactly what you need and making every pound count and all of that. So I think that it's important for that. If you want to have that feeling of your group against nature, against the odds, whatever, and you're only going to have what you take with you, it's a different approach than what I feel is a much more passive kind of stance, which is I've got my character with his numbers on this sheet, and I'm just going to show up, and there's going to be an adventure there, and I'm going to fight the thing, and then I'm going to walk away with all the gold. It's just assumed that there's this story path before you that is just wide open for you to wander into and conquer, versus something that's a little more realistic in a way that, you've got limitations as a mortal human. So here's a great example. The other day when we first entered Fachilrak's tomb, y'all just didn't have enough rope to get down the damn dungeon because nobody fucking brought the rope. I thought that was hilarious. And I guarantee next time somebody's going to bring the fucking rope. I don't know. It's just a different kind of play. It's a less entitled kind of play. And I think the victories are more earned in that way.
I can see that.
I have struggled with doing carrying capacity in a way that makes me satisfied. I don't like the idea of just it's a weight and you can just pile it on until you have met that weight restriction. I don't like that. I've played around with having a carrying capacity system based on how much you can carry in your hands and how much you can carry in different containers, where containers give you the ability to carry more, kind of like the video game Death Stranding kind of deals with. But carrying capacity is one of those things that, Jordan, for all the reasons you said, I love the idea of it, but when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of handling it, it just ends up being a train wreck because most players don't give a shit. And if you're the type of DM who's going to make that a big thing, I always feel like I'm just being an asshole for enforcing this type of thing.
I absolutely couldn't do it if we were doing pencil and paper for that reason. The fact that I can use Google Docs to create drop-down menus for all of the items that can fit in a particular location and automatically calculate the weight and automatically apply penalties to all the things that it needs to be when your encumbrance gets to a certain level. That's the only way that I've been able to see it run smoothly. And even with this, like, players are so goddamn fucking lazy. It's crazy. Even with this, I occasionally have to go in and like fix stuff on people's sheets. But for the most part, I feel like I've gone, 95% of the way there. Like, can you please meet me this extra 5% and just like be slightly mindful about how many of a thing you have on your person? Like, come on.
I think this goes back to an old tension in just game design in general, and the difficulty, the special difficulty that a DM has on their shoulders when they take on the game. And I think in a lot of ways, the DM is the only real player in a game, because players by necessity are so much less invested in the game. You really have to, as a DM, pick your poison on where you're going to have fun, what lines do you draw, as in, this is where I'm getting fun out of running this game. Me personally, carrying capacity is just not something that makes me have fun in a game. But like, the downside of that is a lot of what you're saying, Jordan, is that when you have players get into, say, I find myself avoiding dungeons as something I run very much for that very reason, because it could very easily happen that your players could get halfway through a dungeon and just literally not have a thing in their inventory they need to get through a situation. And then you have to work out like, okay, and a lot of times it's just puts you in a position as a DM. Am I going to make them backtrack to a town? That's what we did. You ended up making us backtrack to a town to re-provision, which was hilarious. But, the way that I think about running games is like, I'm always trying to keep it on like the roller coaster. Like, almost every game is a roller coaster ride in and of itself. And I really like to think of the game as in rising tension, rising action, go to climax, and then drop off and then go on to the next session. And like, if you're in the middle of a rise to some sort of important point that you're trying to get to, and then they're like, well, we don't have rope. You're like, God damn it. How do you not have rope? Fuck. Now what do we do? You know what I mean? It just kind of can take the air out of the game in a way that I don't like as a DM.
I guarantee we are going to remember us running out of rope and half of the party having to go back into town to rescue the other half of the party who was down in the dungeon. who some of the players down there were the ones who had rope. You just didn't have a way of connecting the two groups to make it so that they could get out. I think that's going to be something that we remember for years.
That's true.
Because it was something that, holy shit, we got in this pickle and there is no way out of it besides splitting the party in half of us going back to town.
And we handled that pretty quick. You know, it wasn't like I made you all roll a random encounter and have a fight with just 2 or 3 of you on the road getting back to town and yada yada. It was, 10 seconds to say, okay, run back to town, get the stuff, blah, 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 tail between your legs. A little worse for wear as far as your self-confidence or something, but certainly lesson learned, teachable moment, and so on. This game I'm running now is all about the old school way of play and the process of dungeon crawling and, the resource management and the process of that. It's not about ratcheting up the tension in this narrative arc and having these specific story beats and yada yada. I'm tired of that way of playing games. I want to do this other thing. So that's why I do it.
And it works well. I mean, I gotta say, the way you have the Google Sheets made, I mean, it really is. It's easy enough for the players that you could afford to be like a, sit on your high horse kind of DM and be like, no, I've made this so easy for you. You didn't buy rope. Sorry.
The other thing is if you give players just carte blanche to say that they just have whatever they want to pull out of their pockets for the situation, there is a type of player that will 100% take advantage of that and wind up fucking with your game in some unforeseen way because you've basically just told them that they've got the entire inventory list in the form of some kind of replicator that lives in their backpack. I'd much rather avoid any of the arguments or, any of the seemingly arbitrary decisions that would force on me to just be like, no, you have what you put on your sheet because that's what you spent your gold on.
That makes sense. And it's definitely true.
Never before have I been in a game where I so badly wanted either a robe of useful items and or a bag of holding or something similar. And since it's first edition, I'm not entirely certain that both of those or all of those exist yet in the game rules.
Just have to keep exploring and find out.
So kind of related to carrying capacity, something that is not handled. Jordan, you mentioned just a little bit ago, like managing resources is a big part of the game. Actually using those resources. I mean, we've been tracking our rations, our torches, our water, our spell component pouches, having a certain number of use of spells. But other things just aren't kept track of, like actually using rope. Like whenever you want to tie up an enemy, are you actually using 50 feet of rope to tie up your enemy, or are you cutting a little bit off of that rope? Because those are two very different things, and if you're using 50 feet of rope, yeah, you can completely tie them down, but if you don't know what you're doing, you can make it very easy for them to escape from it.
That's a good point.
And that's just another thing that if you don't have like a digital tool for keeping track of it, it gets so tedious to actually keep track of, okay, my 50 feet of rope is now 35 feet of rope. I've never seen or done it myself, keeping track of resources like that.
That seems a bit too much.
Yeah, somewhere you have to, draw the line and say, okay, I've abstracted it to a point that I'm satisfied with, and I'm not going to keep track of every little piece of string. How many times have you said, I tear a piece off of my shirt to bandage the wound? Well, how many bandages do you have in a shirt? How many bandages do you currently have in the shirt that you're wearing? Are you going to buy a new shirt when you get to town, or are you just going to walk around with like a belly shirt on?
I've seen Hot Shots Part 2. I know how that scene goes.
What else do we not cover? I think we covered like most of the kind of low-level resource and hygiene kind of stuff. There's other things that we've got on this list here that are more like ideas or experiences. Do you guys want to get into some of those?
Yeah, I would love to get into one of the interpersonal issues.
I've got a lot to say about those, so I'll let you guys pick which one we go to.
Well, I'd like to talk about family and how it's always a part of the background and it's never something that is remembered by the player more than 3 or 4 sessions into the game. And it just becomes something that theoretically exists, but isn't really a part of the game, despite the fact that our family is probably the most important part of our lives for most people.
The family issue is something that I've come to pretty solid conclusions about in the later, like in the more recent part of my gaming. And I remember when I was younger, I always felt like, players should come up with really rich backstories, have these story threads that in my mind I was like, well, me as a DM, I could use them. But as I've gotten more experienced, I do prefer players to be completely unattached and have fairly sparse backgrounds for that very reason. Because if you figure you've got 4 players minimum and each one have these family interests, we'll say, in this particular situation, or a romantic interest, that really encourages the player to go off on personal tangents in the game. And if you want to build your game around that, I could see that being totally okay. But for the most part, it can often lead the party in directions that are not in the party's best interest, but just serve the interests of an individual player that can really check out a lot of other players. How do you guys feel about it?
In the games where I have seen a player have an extensive family, it is not something that fulfills the character. It is a resource that they can tap. It is, my dad is a wizard, my mom was a bard, my uncle was a rogue, and they have these resources that I should have access to because I am a part of this family lineage. I have a very bad taste in my mouth about this in particular because it has come up in a game that I was playing in not too awfully long ago, where I had a player who was like that, who was insistent that they should have additional things for their character just because they had written it in their backstory of having basically family who was wealthy and had all of these capabilities that that they thought that their character should have access to that as well.
Again, it goes back to the kind of game that you want to run. There's, game systems that deal with this much better than Dungeons and Dragons does. I've never played them, but I've heard about Pendragon, where you set up a dynasty, and you care about each season, going to the social events and like getting your sons married off and all that kind of thing. When you're an itinerant adventurer, just kind of wandering the continent, I think that the only use for a family in that situation is to create some kind of like tragic backstory or some revenge narrative or something like that when they get killed off. Otherwise, they're just going to sit around and people don't remember them. And I've never experienced what you're describing, Clayton, but I could totally see somebody playing some like entitled noble or something that, well, I just call my dad.
Yep. And that works in modern settings as well, making a character, like putting the points into it to make them from a wealthy family. It was actually a modern day game that I had that experience in.
But like I feel like in a system, like you said, some systems handle these things better than others. And if you have playing one of the many systems that have like a contacts or a resources mechanic and building a family that has means, if you've sunk your, whatever currency the game uses to build characters to have that, I could see how that would be a little less entitlement and a little bit more just like, well, this is just something I invested points in. But that still puts the DM in a difficult situation where, like you said, they're constantly kind of have to negotiate with your player, like, what's the limits of what your family or your contacts or your resources have? I've never seen that done awful well on the player or the DM side in any game. I'm trying to think games like, Vampire the Masquerade or the White Wolf systems that have a lot of that.
I could also see that like really blowing back in a character's face. Like you sit down and you make your noble character with your rich family or whatever, and then your dad is fucking Tywin Lannister. That's probably not going to be much fun. Like you're gonna really fucking hate your family, and how much control do you want the NPCs for your backstory to have over what you're doing in your day-to-day life? Now on the other end, once you're established and get to the point where you might be buying a keep and setting up your estate, all that sort of thing, I could see there being an interesting thing where you pass the torch to your children, and you retire your old character to be the lord of the manor, and your favorite son goes off with your hard-won +3 longsword to go do battle for the next generation. I've never seen that happen. I think it could be pretty cool if you had a really long-running game like that, but yeah.
There's a system that I think does this, I'm not going to say in a good way because I never played it, but in intriguing ways. The Modifius Dune system I read a bit about, and part of the era of Dune they chose to play in was the first thing that the party does is create as a collaborative. They make their own house. It's assumed that all the players in the game are from that house, but it's not. It is a part of it's like a family kind of thing, kind of like the Paul Atreides and Duke Leto kind of thing. But others could just be, you could play the Gurney Halleck, the not necessarily family, but just that's the noble house you're attached to, and that's kind of how it was played out. And the whole way the game was structured is it kind of was built around political intrigue that you have to further your house in some way in the grand political scale of things. That's why I didn't run the game, honestly, is because it just looked like too much. It created so much political intrigue and things like that's daunting as a DM, honestly.
I think Legend of the Five Rings is another game system that tries to bring that in a lot. The main focus of that game would be whatever particular clan your character was from, and the family obligations, the honor obligations related to that. A lot of those types of things, it just seems like they don't play well in the mindset of most players in what they want out of a game. I don't know if I would really like a game that focused a lot on like those aspects of Bushido, but I've never really had the opportunity to find out how well it actually works. I know there's a lot of people who play and love Legend of the Five Rings, but I've just never seen it done.
I think to me in my mind, just thinking about it as we play it, I don't think I'm being redundant, but to sum up my thoughts on it, it's like typically anything that takes the agency away from the players tend not to enjoy that. I've tended not to enjoy that much as a player in games that put me directly subordinate to a greater cause, because it gets really easy to get put on rails and get put in the passenger seat of the game. And in most games that I've played in and tried to run, one of the goals as the DM has been to make sure that the party stays in the driver's seat. I just think that's the most fun. And those types of family obligations, either like we're talking about in where it's actually built into the game, but even whenever they're just shoehorned in to backgrounds and things of that nature in D&D or what have you, it can still kind of do the same thing. It's a lot of times just used as an easy way for the DM to issue commands to the players. It's like, well, why am I doing this? Well, it's because your dad, or because your house, or your lord, or whatever is telling you to do it. So go do it. It's hard to have fun.
Yeah, the only way to have individual player agency in that kind of situation is if you're playing the house itself, and that is your character. You're not playing individuals. You might take the role of individuals at particular times, but when I think about a lot of the dialogue of Tywin Lannister, he's always talking about the house, always talking about the family, and this like generational kind of obligation that he sees himself as a part of. And that lends to some of what I've read about early D&D players who would have a huge batch of characters that they might draw from to play individual adventures, but some of their retainers are like getting up in level and that sort of thing. But yeah, if you're playing just one person and you're caring about that one person's story, that's not the right scale for things like this.
Kind of thinking about family in a slightly different way, and definitely along the ways of a line that you were alluding to was like just as a patriarch or as a matriarch of a group or even just one individual. I think I've only ever played in one game where a player at the beginning of the game said, okay, I have a daughter. My daughter is very important to me. And throughout the entirety of the game, that remained true. That wasn't just an item on the character sheet that got forgotten about. I've had a few other players who have had quote families. I've played in post-apocalyptic games where players had made like that they're a member of a family and they have siblings and they have children, but especially in a post-apocalyptic game, I want for those things to be the family obligation is not of the family is making me have to do things. It's I have to do things for the family. I have to provide for the family. And I've only ever seen it happen once in a game where it actually got played out in that way.
Yeah, I think it can be done well. It's just not what a lot of people come to the table for. Certain people do. Not really me. I did have one game where it was locally based. We stayed in a town for a good little bit, maybe 5 or 6 sessions. And my character I had written into a backstory some family members, and the DM worked them in, like, kind of organically. And it worked out okay. And it added depth to my character. They ended up dying, of course. But it all came naturally in the game. It wasn't forced or nothing. It was fun.
So kind of relating to, well, in my mind, kind of relating to family obligations, are other obligations of mundane life, like a person's job. This is particularly in modern day games that aren't set in a post-apocalyptic world, like something that is set in a modern or relatively modern setting, like vampire or not vampire, just like Hunter, like games where yes, your character is this person who hunts monsters and stuff like that, but how do you earn your living? Those are the types of things that just don't come up in my games. The only time it comes up is like my character is a reporter, so it is my job to do these investigations type thing. Everything else, your job is just something that is on your character sheet. I can't tell you how many games of Call of Cthulhu and World of Darkness I have played in where the character's stats have them built up to be basically a world-renowned doctor, but they never have to go to work.
I haven't played in too many games set like that, to be honest with you.
I think it pretty much only happens in modern games. Fantasy and sci-fi stuff, there's, adventuring as a profession. The constraints of the modern world and capitalism that make us figure out some way to get by while doing things interesting off hours.
I'm trying to think if there's an exception. I can't think of one.
The book for Promethean the Created. If you're not familiar, this came out in like 2005, 2006. This was a World of Darkness, one of the Chronicles of Darkness settings. And in this, you played basically like a Frankenstein's monster type creature. And the goal for your creature was, or for your character, was to try to become human. This was a game where there was an end point. There was a win condition for your character, is you could become a human. And part of that was to be a person, to have all of the experiences of a regular person. And you could gain benefit, or you could gain specific experience points for maintaining a job. That's one of the examples in the book of how to get in touch with humanity and to establish your own humanity was to hold down a job.
It sounds
It's
horrible.
that fucking gag comic from the 1E Dungeon Master's Guide. Ugh.
See, Promethean is probably the greatest game that I have never played. It's one of those games that, man, I wish I could be a player in this game and experience the struggles of trying to be a person. But I don't think there's hardly anybody else who
That's
really
my
wants to
everyday
do
life.
that.
Right.
There's a part of me that just really wants to try it. And I know that there's a lot of other game systems that have been coming out, particularly like more indie games in the past few years have been trying to emulate different parts of just mundane life. Like there are high school role-playing games that are basically just you going to high school type of things. There's a part of me that really wants to do that, but then there's another part of me that I'm in my early 40s. I don't want to go back to high school.
Oh man, I really botched my essay roll. My parents are going to kill me.
Oh my god. I can think of a few games that I would have less interest in playing.
And that's why we never play them.
I mean, not to go off on a tangent, but, I feel like it makes sense that games are going that way. It's just, I'll never be interested in a game where I'm not a hero or exceptional in some way. And I guess, I'm sure that those games, you are an exceptional, high school student or something like that. And maybe that's the trick of these games. They turn a mundane aspect of everybody's life into an epic kind of storyline, I suppose. But I don't know. That's not why I come to the table. I want to be maybe I'm old school. I'm pushing 40, so probably that's true. I just want to be a hero. I don't want to have a job. I want to swing a sword.
For a soap opera.
I feel like we're running low on this topic. We've kind of hit it, all the things is there anything we missed?
There are some mundane things that I have on my list. One of the things is the effects of weather on activity. I was elated in our Thursday game several weeks ago when I described how shitty the weather was and that it was raining and all that, and you guys were like, nah, let's not go out today. I loved that. That was the first time that has ever happened in a game, and I just wanted to thank you guys for reading what I was presenting to you guys, because the game is for anybody who is not familiar, the game is a exploration of basically a new world. This is a fantasy equivalent of the discovery of the Americas, and exploration is a big part of the game, and I'm trying to bring in a lot of real world factors. And the fact that I was presenting the daily weather report as part of what you learn about the day whenever you first wake up, and you guys were using that information. Thank you very much for doing that.
Feel free to say fuck off, but just as a request to peek behind the curtain, are you doing random weather rolls, or are these like plot determined weather rolls?
Neither. I have a location in the world that I am looking at the weather of.
Oh, it's truly random. Okay.
Well, it's not random. It's a real world location, and it's the weather patterns that they experienced in 2021.
Well, by random, I mean completely unpredictable.
Well, meteorologists might argue about whether or not it's completely unpredictable.
Though, I mean, I think I'm glad that you enjoyed it. So clearly, this take isn't completely true, but I think it almost illustrates the reason why it's a non-factor. Now, I guess it's different on the DM side of the table is if you have like time-sensitive triggers, like, if you're a good DM and you've said like, this is going to happen on this day on the calendar, this is going to happen on this day on the calendar, and that can definitely come and make a huge impact on the game. But I feel like a real reason why people don't do it is kind of exactly what we did. And I guess some people wouldn't do that, but it's like if it's raining really bad and your plan is to go out and adventure in the wilderness that you know nothing about, it probably just makes more sense to just not go out that day. And then you're like, okay, DM, well, fast forward past the rain, please, because we're not going to go out in that. And that's pretty much exactly what happened, which was fine.
Yeah, I don't think that the environment gets enough play in games as being the main thing that humanity had to struggle with until it continues to have to struggle with is dealing with the environment. That's an area that just doesn't get a lot of play, and I'm trying to impart that into this current game that we're playing. Kind of related to weather, one tendency that I have seen that every single time this comes up after the session is whenever I smack myself on the head, and as if I'm the GM, I'm like, why didn't I stop this from happening? Why didn't I say something about this? And this is the tendency of player characters whenever they are obstructed by a body of water like a river or something like that. Their first inclination is to swim across it. And I never in the moment think, okay, what's the weight of the gear? What's the effect of all of this shit getting wet? It's a level of mundanity that doesn't get play, even though it should be a major thing. Rations get wet. Rations get ruined. Paper, electronics, same thing. If they get wet, they're ruined. And especially before the modern age, to make something waterproof was a big hassle. And this is just something that's hand-waved. And whenever I'm the DM, I always think of it after the session is over. Oh, I should have said something to them to let them know that they were going to ruin a lot of their gear. This kind of goes back to the carrying capacity thing. But this is something that and not just as a DM, as a player, I also forget about this. Like in Jordan's game, we went across some water, and it was a couple of hours or the next morning after the session, I realized there is no way in hell my character would have gotten in that water. I would have gotten my spell book wet.
True. I never thought about that.
Yeah, this gets back to the game that you're playing when you're not in combat and what else involved there. I think there's interesting play to be had there, and I'm glad that you are thinking along those lines, Clayton, because I feel like if all you're doing is either talking in character to an NPC or fighting, that game is going to get boring, and it's going to be a lot of just listening to the DM talk and just sitting there rolling dice and stuff. These like travel related activities, dealing with weather, dealing with provisions and all that, I like it. I think it's interesting and creates tension and problems that are emergent from the play rather than some contrived trap or some other kind of encounter that has been laid there for the players to wander across.
See, I definitely that's something I need to improve on whenever I run games, but to me, I feel like I don't ever see it as like just having needless NPC chatter. You know what I mean? I feel like, and maybe this is just my preferred play. It's like I feel like a game should be solving a problem, right? I mean, I think that every game, the players ought to be solving some sort of problem. There should be a purpose to their adventuring. And, when a player is interacting with an NPC or going to a dungeon or going to a locale, they're going there with purpose. And that's why a lot of times I find myself tossing those mundane, challenges kind of by the scrap heap, because a lot of times I feel like the players are already pursuing enough conflict. Like there's already enough conflict baked into the game because they're, or challenges, because you've written those things in, right? And, there's a balancing act to be had there that, like, as they're pursuing their ultimate goals, they run into these challenges that make things more difficult. That's definitely something that is important in your games, to have, like, just unplanned, unforeseen obstacles in your way to your broader goals. But sometimes the minutiae can become the game, and that is just not a game I like to play. I don't like the game where the minutia is the game. You know what I mean? And I feel like when you're keeping track of all these mundane things, eventually it becomes a game. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and this is something that a DM should let the players know before the start of the game, whether or not this level of mundanity, this resource management, this just keeping track of daily life is going to be a part of the game or not. Because you're right, a lot of players, that's not why they show up to the table.
Yeah, for sure. I already write my grocery list and go to the store and then, balance my checkbook. It's games that make me do that are becoming dangerously similar to the things about my life I don't like, that I'm trying to escape in the first place from gaming.
I will say, though, from a DM's perspective, it's much more interesting for me to run a game where there's things like that emerge, because there's interesting stuff that I didn't foresee that we get to play through, and it's almost like randomly generated content. How could I have possibly, without seeming to be just a complete arbitrary dictator, have set up a situation where you guys don't have enough rope to rescue the other half of your party at the bottom of the dungeon? It's weird little shit like that is quirky and memorable, because it happened honestly. It happened naturally out of the play. Anything else is just sort of like scripted, cutscenes or foregone conclusions that you're just kind of playing through. So for me, it keeps me interested to see, what's going to happen, what's going to fuck up, and what's the weather going to do, what's the group going to do.
Yeah, I mean, not having enough rope to get through a dungeon is very similar to, mechanically, to not having ranged weapons in a combat scenario that really needs them. You know what I mean? You wouldn't let your players retcon, oh man, I should have had a bow. Oh man, we need a bow in this situation. Can I just write in that I had a bow? I was like, no, you can't, because you didn't. And that changes the dynamic of the game right now hugely. That's a little more similar to that. But I guess if you really drill down, I mean, that's true for all these resource management things.
The first time I was in a situation that you described of a player not having a ranged attack, I changed the scenario to allow them to be able to do something. That was the last time I'm ever doing that, because then the player always expects that, okay, they're going to have some sort of option presented to them rather than them coming to the game with the character who has the options at their disposal. It's a shift of the responsibility of playing the game. Now, whenever I run a game, if I run a combat and there's a player who doesn't have a way of effectively doing anything to the enemy, and they could have just by having one little piece of equipment, I'm not going to change that. I'm not going to change that scenario. And this first fight is your lesson to get something to be able to be effective in when this situation comes up again, because it is definitely going to come up again.
Yeah, setting expectations for players is going to alter the entire feel and course of your game, and both explicitly and implicitly in the way that you set the expectations. And if you hold people accountable like that for specific choices that they made or oversights, that's a different kind of group. I really am just bored and tired of stories where the players just have to show up and say their lines and roll their dice and everything just kind of does what it's supposed to do. There's nothing exciting happening there. I'll watch a show that's better acted and better written if that's what I want to experience.
Better acted? I'm insulted.
Well, somehow we managed to talk about this for an hour. I'm shocked.
Well, let's go ahead and do geek things then.
Okay, I agree.
I'll go first. There has been a movie trailer that has come out that is a movie I am very much looking forward to. It is a new George Miller movie, the director of such wonderful movies as Babe, Pig in the City, Happy Feet 2, and oh yeah, the Mad Max series. This movie is called 3,000 Years of Longing. It stars Idris Elba and Tilda Swinton. Idris Elba plays a genie who is giving 3 wishes to Tilda Swinton. And from the trailer, this movie looks like it's going to be a beautiful, chaotic mess of a movie, and I can't wait to see it. It's supposed to come out this summer.
Lots of good stuff coming out in June, July. I'm looking forward to this summer. It should be good geek content in general. I'll go next. Mine's super simple. I'm just going to shout out a YouTube video I watched. It was made by Wired. Google, if you YouTube search for just longest D&D game, I saw this recently. And there's a game that as of April, I guess, of 2022, ran by a guy named Robert Wardaw, I believe is his name. He's a history professor. And he's been running a D&D game continuously for 40 years. And it's just a short 10-minute video giving him his 15 minutes and congratulating him and showing kind of how do you pull off a game of that length, and how it's just a huge part of his life. And it just tickled me because I'm long like gaming, and the idea of running the same continuous game for 40 years is so epic. I can't even wrap my head around it, but this guy has managed to do it. One of the cool, interesting parts was he started the game before he even had kids, and then he's raised his kids. His kids have played the game, and then they've even had relationships they've grown on to be teenagers and young adults. They've had relationships with people that they let play in the game, and now they still play in the game. So it's just really interesting how this dude's pulled it off, both just practically and just socially. It's a good watch. Go watch it.
I saw that video. That guy's my hero. So mine is a YouTube channel for this. He's a British guy. His channel is called Willy Muffin. He does a bunch of old D&D module reviews, really long ones. Like I'm talking 40 minutes to an hour, and goes really in depth on stuff. He's very well-spoken, intelligent individual with a lot of experience, and really gets into the details of what's interesting about certain modules and what other ones are lacking. He's one of my go-tos now for any module that I'm thinking about running from the classic lineup. Willy Muffin, good stuff. He deserves more subs.
Well, guys, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's go.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.